And so you realize that our lives are bridged in so many different ways other than simply the reason why they're attending a conference or, the podcast that you listen to. It's much more interconnected than we realize.
Welcome to the Strokecast. A Generation X stroke survivor explores rehab, recovery, the frontiers of neuroscience, and how to peel a banana with one hand.
Hello, I'm Bill Monroe, and welcome to episode 53 of the Strokecast. Back on that June morning when I was rolling into the ER, you have the weirdest thoughts that go through your head as your brain is just trying to, first survive and second, sort of make sense of everything that's going on and just try to process it and figure out what your next step is going to be or can be and what's happening now. And one of the thoughts that went through my head was, now I have a topic for a keynote speech. I talk a lot about public speaking. Longtime listeners to this show know that I also host another podcast all about public speaking, where I help folks become more effective public speakers in as little as 2 minutes a week. And you can visit 2minutetalktips.com for more details about that show. But my affinity for this skill, project, hobby, whatever you want to call it, is also why I usually listen to Grant Baldwin's podcast, The Speaker Lab. And I was listening to an episode one day when he was interviewing a guest whose focus was on how you can build a life in such a way as to have an impact on the world. The guest talked about coming to this perspective after spending some time sitting on the kitchen floor one morning, having just survived a stroke. Of course, my ears instantly perked up, and I knew I wanted to have Pete Smith on the Strokecast to share his journey. Pete is an international speaker and coach in the fields of leadership, management, personal growth, and development. His energetic, edgy, and interactive style is complemented by his ability to provide practical takeaways that actually work while having a little fun in the process. He is the author of Dare to Matter, which hit the bestseller list in the business motivation and self-improvement category in 2017. Having a stroke at the age of 35, Pete has since used that experience to inspire, educate, and entertain audiences throughout the world on the importance of pursuing significance in their personal and professional lives. As he says, if you relentlessly pursue success and happiness in your life, you are settling for less than what you were created for. Married to an incredible wife, proud dad of 2 amazing boys, and part-time chew boy for an Irish setter, Pete resides in Arlington, Virginia. So now, let's meet Pete Smith. So Pete, thank you so much for joining us here on Strokecast this week.
Yeah, Bill, thanks so much for the invite. I'm excited about it.
It's awesome how our different fields of interest can overlap in different areas because I found you and first heard your story listening to another podcast, the Speaker Lab podcast, about the business of public speaking.
Right.
And so it's awesome to have you connected and to see other survivors who, have gotten much further along on this journey than I have.
Well, it's interesting that you say that because one of the, I'll say a benefit to having a stroke is the stories that I get to hear from people when you mentioned public speaking before. So after a presentation, if I'm at a book table, I'll have the attendees come up to me and they won't talk about the presentation. They'll talk about their experience of either having something similar or knowing a family member or a friend who recently had a stroke, and so you realize that our lives are bridged in so many different ways other than simply the reason why they're attending a conference or, the podcast that you listen to. It's much more interconnected than we realize.
Absolutely. And it really sort of gets to the whole element of just the nature of being an individual is that we tend to define ourselves in a particular context, in a particular way. And when we're talking with other folks, we often see them in that particular context at the time. Maybe they are a book fan and we're talking about a book. Maybe they're going to the same movie as us. Maybe they're attending a conference with us, or maybe they're attending a support group with us. But we're only seeing a very small part of their lives in a small context. And everybody's life is so much richer than just the thing they're involved in at the moment.
Right. And a lot of that could even be tied back to how people describe their event, even with the stroke. So for example, some people, when they tell me they have had a stroke, they'll define themselves, or they'll describe themselves as a stroke victim. Other people will define themselves as a stroke survivor. Other people don't put a label on it at all, and they'll simply say that they had a stroke. Other people will make more of it for themselves, and they'll say that they suffered a stroke. And so you have the ability to create a context around your experience for yourself, not to mention the context of relatability that we have with other people that may share similar interests, and we're brought together for different reasons. And so, I think it's an important distinction to understand the context that we are creating individually, and then how that relates to how we see other people as well.
Absolutely. The language is so important. When we talk about things like neuroplasticity and how the idea that the key thing about recovery is that nerves that fire together wire together. The patterns we repeat, it's why in rehab we have to do thousands of repetitions of an action to get the brain to wire itself. That language that we use to describe our lives, that language is also causing connections. It's also causing rewiring in the brain. And it's why it's so important to choose your words and how you describe yourself carefully, because the brain, as it's rewiring, is going to accommodate your decision about how you think about yourself.
Totally agree. Yeah. And the good thing about it is the wording that we use is simply a reflection of our beliefs about an event, right? And so in other words, the reality is an event took place, and the event for us could be that we had a stroke. We had something that the medical community calls having a stroke. What we make that event mean is entirely up to us. And that's what typically will come across in how we define or describe that experience to others, is really what we have formed about our belief about that event. And so if we feel victimized, we're more inclined to say that we were a stroke victim. If we feel empowered or the overwhelming gratitude that we're still here, we may bring out this survival instinct within us. We're stroke survivors. And so, the good thing is we get to create whatever belief we want about that event. There's a lot of freedom in that.
Absolutely. So we talk about this major life event. What was your life like before this stroke came into your life? Life
was honestly fine. So first of all, my stroke was May 6th, 2010, about 6:45 in the morning. I was up for work. I had already gotten ready. I was just getting ready to leave the door, and I was standing at my kitchen table or dining room table, checking emails that came in the night before, closed my laptop, and boom, that's when I had the stroke. At the time, I was an operations executive at a nonprofit alternative school for kids with disabilities. I loved my job. This happened in May. In March, 2 months prior, I had just recently gotten engaged to Whitney, who's my now wife, and things were going really well. I played softball the night before, so I was active, and all in all, you would take a snapshot of what my life looked like in that moment, and I would say things were great. Things were great.
Yeah. So what happened that day?
So I mentioned that I had the stroke. So what happened? I ended up closing my laptop, and all of a sudden my legs got really wobbly. And I remember thinking, that's odd. Is it because I haven't had coffee yet? Is it because I didn't breakfast? What's the deal? And so I stood there for a second.
Coffee is a good all around diagnostic estimate.
Listen, coffee solves a lot of problems. It may create a couple, but look, there's coffee's great. So I'm thinking maybe I just didn't have that yet. Maybe I'm overtired. I went to bed late the night before because of the game. And so I stood there for another few seconds, and my legs got even a little bit more wobbly. And I remember thinking, something's wrong. And then they got to the point where I knew I couldn't hold myself up anymore, that I was going to fall down. And so I quickly called out to Whitney, who happened to be upstairs that morning, and fell backwards. And there was a chair behind me, and it kind of broke my fall. So I ended up sitting upright on my dining room floor. And, at that moment, my mind's racing to try to figure out what is going on, and I remember thinking, am I having a seizure? Now, what's odd about that is I don't know. First of all, I've never had a seizure in my life. And so I don't even know how I would be able to recognize if I even was having one. But that's, your mind's racing to try to figure out what's happening. I didn't feel the weight on my chest. I know people who have had heart attacks. They describe the heaviness on their chest. I didn't have that, but I couldn't figure out what was going on. And it wasn't until Whitney came downstairs and called 911, and she was on the phone with paramedics. And I heard her say, "A stroke? I don't know. How would I know?" And all of a sudden I remember thinking, what do you mean a stroke? Like, I'm not having a stroke. I was 35 at the time, and I was just shy of my 36th birthday. And I remember thinking, I'm not having a stroke. Oh, old people have strokes, and I don't have any of the symptoms. I'm not a drinker or smoker, or I don't have blood pressure issues. There's nothing wrong. I shouldn't be having a stroke. And then I zoom back in and focus on Whitney, and I realized she was crouched down in front of me, and she was touching my right arm, which was folded in my lap. And I remember looking down at my hand. Looking down at her hand, looking down at my arm, and I couldn't feel a thing. And it was just it's such an eerie feeling, knowing that she's obviously grabbing your arm. It's your arm, and yet there's a 100% disconnect. I couldn't feel anything. So, then a million things go through your mind. Is this permanent, and what's going to happen? And luckily for me, ambulances came and took me to the hospital, and recovery was, believe it or not, shortly thereafter. But that's kind of how the stroke happens.
Wow. One of the things that I find really interesting, and, there's some sort of selection bias here, I suppose. But when I talk with most of the folks I've talked with who've had their stroke, under 40, have been healthy and athletic and didn't have any of the classic signs of stroke. And, one of the folks I've had on the show in the past, another Whitney, explain, her stroke at 28 as a healthy, athletic person actually inspired multiple sort of discussions around neurologists at multiple facilities going, I don't know.
Yeah. Well, they ended up, so I had a clot, which is what they found right at the base of my brain. And they traced that through a number of tests over spending a few days in the hospital. They finally traced it back to a hole in my heart, the PFO. And what I find interesting about that is obviously it's something that you have since birth, but you mentioned the former Whitney who's an athlete. I was in athletics my entire life. I wrestled all the way through college. And so I had yearly physicals from the time I was 6 all the way through 22, and nothing was ever detected. And, hearing about how common it is, or more common than you realize, how many people actually have that opening in their heart, and yet they never know until something like this happens. So it was certainly eye-opening for me to think that I've spent my entire life up until that point with something like that. And then, Doc said, look, there are people that can spend their entire lives with this and it never impacts them negatively. And yet on occasion, these are things that happen, and that's how they end up diagnosing it. So it was very interesting.
Right. Yeah, exactly. The PFO is such a fascinating thing. It's one of those things that, makes it possible to live in utero, and in 25 to 33% of the population, it just never closes in that first month after birth like it's supposed to.
Right. Right. And I would say the majority of the people who have it don't know they have it.
Yeah. Exactly. So what was your treatment like? I mean, at 2010, they weren't doing thrombectomies really. So
no. So here's the fascinating thing is, on the way to the hospital, I was able to start. I was able to wiggle my fingers, and so things were coming back pretty quickly. And when I got to the hospital, I could talk more, and all of a sudden, my recovery was pretty rapid. So what happened is they ended up taking the scans where they saw the clot, but then what the scans also revealed was how the brain started redirecting blood flow around the clot. And it was in that crucial moment, you have your few hours before you're not able to get the injection anymore to bust up the clot. And there was a lot of discussion around, well, should we give you the injection now, or do we wait? The downside, of course, is if we give you the injection and it breaks up the clot is so close to the base of your brain that if it travels north a little bit, there could be much worse damage. But if we don't do it now, we're going to be outside that window, And so the decision was made to not get the injection, to kind of let's ride this out. Let's see how it turns out. And so things started coming back pretty quickly. They transferred me to another hospital that had more of a stroke specialty. And when I arrived there was almost this little bit of disbelief, because I was talking again. I could move my hands. And so it was one of those like, did you really have the stroke or did you not? And while I was in the emergency room at the other hospital, all of a sudden my body kind of went in shock, a little bit of a delayed shock. And I turned pale white and I thought I was going to pass out. And so they rushed me and did more scans but they didn't know what to do. It was interesting. It was one of those things where everyone was kind of just sitting around waiting to see what happens. And so, I spent a few days in the hospital. They did all sorts of tests and they looked for other clots in my legs. And that's when eventually they went through down to the throat, saw the hole, and said they think this is what happened. So, I'd like to say that it was some great recovery plan that we had. We didn't. I would certainly say that I'm here through the grace of God. I think has helped with recovery tremendously.
Sure. So it sounds like you were able to come through that without major deficits. Do you still have to deal with deficits from the stroke today?
I don't. My wife would probably disagree. She may think that I have short-term memory disability on some things, because I think it's just selective, not remembering of some things. But the reality is, no. I'm very blessed that I don't have the lingering physical disabilities. I don't have the cognitive disabilities. What I have now is the experience. What I have now are the memories, and so it's a different type of battle than the physical battle.
Yeah, absolutely. And dealing with the trauma and the uncertainty of what's happening in that moment, that in and of itself is a life-altering type of thing.
It can be. And here again, it goes back to, you get to choose what you want to make of that event. And so my guess is that there are some people who choose to have no more meaning to them than what they had for breakfast yesterday. That's their choice. Others get a chance to look at it through a different perspective and really ask, what do you want to make of this event? What do you want to make it mean, if anything? So, here again, it goes back to, we all have the beauty of making that choice as to the events that occur in our lives.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And so how has it affected your career path?
It's completely changed it. So what happened that happened in 2010. And so what I didn't share with you is, during the stroke, when I hit the ground, sitting upright on my dining room floor, all of a sudden I heard my body begin to shut down. And the good news is I'm sure many of your listeners can relate to what I'm talking about. It's kind of hard to describe, people who haven't experienced it, what that sounds like. But to me, it really sounded like an engine winding down, and I remember thinking, holy crap, I'm dying. Like I can't stop this. And it's driving me crazy because there's nothing I can do to stop this engine that's winding down. And that's when I thought, I have about 60 seconds left to live. Like this is it. And so many of the thoughts that went through my mind were fascinating to me. I thought about Whitney. I thought about how she was going to come downstairs. She's going to turn the corner. She's going to see me dead on my dining room floor. And I remember thinking, God, what's the impact going to be on her? Like, how do you move on from this? I thought about my parents, my brothers, my sisters, my family. I thought about the softball game the night before, honestly, as odd as that is. There was a call that was made during the game that I disagreed with. And I remember thinking, well, the umpire is probably just a really nice guy. And then boom, that thought was out. But then I remember asking myself a simple but powerful question, which was, did I live? Did I do everything that I wanted to do? Like, I can't stop it. My body's shutting down. Did I live? I had an aunt years ago who died of brain aneurysm. And I remember thinking, so this is how it happened. And so these are the thoughts that are going through my mind. But it was really that did I live question that captured me. Did I do everything that I wanted to do? Did I hold back at all? Did I change anyone's life? Did I live? And what I was really getting at is, was I significant? Did I matter? So from that experience, since then, I ended up leaving my job the following year, and I've kind of set out on this journey to really figure out, what does it mean to live in a very significant way? If do we have to wait till those moments when you think you have a minute left to live to really figure out how we're meant to live at all to begin with? Or is it that we can apply some practicality to this whole concept of significance? And that's what I've set out to do is really try to figure out, what does that actually mean to live in a very significant way? And so I just started, through self-awareness, but awareness with others, and interviewing and researching. I started to recognize that there are certain things in people's lives that continuously pop up that will determine whether or not they stay in a rut or they continue to thrive. And I started kind of piecing it together and came up with what I call the 6 to significance framework, which is looking at these 6 pillars that when we just focus on these things, the way that we think changes, the things that we do change, and the results that we create change. And by doing that, we live in a much more significant way. We live in a way that actually matters. And so that's since 2011, that's what I've been out there doing, between speaking and training on this and coaching. And it's really transformed my life completely.
Yeah. And so you've been doing a lot of this training and coaching, and it sounds like you've recently made the shift to step up to the big stage and do more of the keynoting. And, this is one of those things that, for some people, that seems like an absolutely terrifying thing, to actually go ahead and speak on those stages, doing keynotes and things like that. There are probably some people who would, prefer to go back and have another stroke than doing that. And by the way, those are jokes that only stroke survivors can make.
Exactly.
But, and for others, it's just super empowering and sort of, that's what they want to do. So how did you make that transition from doing the training and coaching to doing more of that keynoting?
I don't have that fear of public speaking that many people do. And so I've always enjoyed it. I've always been intrigued by it. The question has always been for me, well, do I have a message that's worth sharing? And, got to the point where I was doing mainly coaching and training. And then I got invited to speak at a local group. I think it was maybe been like a Rotary or something like that. And I thought, I'll just tell a different story, because up until that point, I didn't really talk about the stroke. And I don't know why. It wasn't because I was embarrassed by it or anything. I just didn't know if it was going to mean anything to anyone else other than me, and so I didn't talk much about it. Well, the first time I started talking about it and kind of lessons learned from it a little bit, boy, that resonated with people in the audience. And I remember someone saying, that's the story that you need to tell. And so I knew that I had the message there. But what's interesting is in the keynotes that I'm giving now, the stroke is that defining moment in my life, which created the awareness that we were meant to live in a very significant way. And I say that because the keynote isn't about the stroke. The keynote is about what the stroke taught me. The keynote is more about, you had the stroke. Here's what I thought about in that moment. Now let's figure out, how do we actually apply this to our lives? And so it was that transition in that way. And then of course you learn how to make a go of it from that profession standpoint. You figure out, what does it take to market yourself as a speaker? What does it take to be on those stages, as you mentioned before? And there's the learning curve there. But if you're committed to it and you feel strongly that this is part of your purpose and how you want to carry that out, then you figure it out and you do it. So that's how it happened.
That is awesome. I also like how you frame that it's not about the stroke. It's about what the stroke taught you. It's less about a specific point in time and more about the results from that point in time, what you've learned, what you've been able to do going forward. And that's really what's so important about, these moments in our lives, whether they're good, bad, indifferent, is that they only really become valuable to us when we can take that moment and say, okay, now what?
Mm-hmm. You're right. And I think having that type of experience, so as odd as it is, you almost wish that others could experience again, it sounds odd, but having the stroke only because of the perspective on life that the proximity of death provides for you. And health scares have a way of bringing people back down to earth, of refocusing their priorities and remembering what actually matters. And so sometimes I think it's hard for people to think about some of the things that I challenge them to think about during the keynotes, precisely because they don't need to, precisely because they're already in there, as they would describe it, they're fine. And see, that's where I think the bulk of the people that I'm trying to reach fit within, let's say, that 80% of people that think that they're fine. Those are the ones I worry about because they don't have the impetus to think about anything differently. And I see that with the messaging that society continues to send us, which is, look, our greatest endeavor is the achievement of both success and happiness. And yet during the stroke, when I thought I had a minute left to live, I didn't think about success or happiness at all. And so sometimes I'm wondering, are we pushing the wrong message? It's not about success and happiness. It's about fulfillment. It's about significance, which is something at a much deeper and much more sustainable way of living life with purpose.
Yeah. And so you took that and you wrote the book, Dare to Matter, Choosing an Unstuck and Unapologetic Life of Significance, which really comes off of that position. It seems like it just makes so much sense combined with what you're talking about. So Why did you write the book, and how did that book come into reality?
I was speaking about this topic before the book came out, and afterwards I would have people come up to me and they would ask, "Did you write a book?" And at the time, I said, "No, I haven't. I'm thinking about it, but I haven't done it." And then I spoke at a conference, and one of the attendees came up to me afterwards, and she said, "Where can I purchase your book?" And though it may sound similar, there really was a tremendous shift for me mentally, because before people were asking, "Have you written a book?" And all of a sudden this person came just assuming that I already had. And that's when I knew, all right, there's interest there. This is attendee driven interest. And that's when I decided, let me write the book about what I'm talking about. Let me go into further detail. Let me give different examples. And so that's why I set out to write that book, to reach a broader audience than those that I was simply able to reach by being in front of them on stage.
That is awesome. And did you then have to go out and find a traditional publisher, or did you pursue the self-publishing space?
So I talked to a number of authors who have done both. And the short version is I ended up self-publishing because I was able to front the cost of going out and hiring editors. I had 3 rounds of editing. I hired the book designer. I hired the interior designer. So I did everything that a traditional publisher would have done for me had I gone through them. I just put the money up front and did it myself. But I found that the best result for me was self-publishing, simply because I was already out there marketing and speaking on the topic anyway. So, nothing bad against traditional publishing, but I didn't think that I needed the additional marketing and exposure because I was already out there building a platform myself. Plus the financial benefits are different in terms of owning the book and the rights to it, and just making sure that they get printed and sent, printed, bound, and sent for conferences. But it was a better financial investment for me to self-publish. Because here's the other thing, Bill. I could go the traditional publishing route, and maybe you'd say, well, they'll give you the upfront. What do they call it?
The advance.
The advance. At the time, who am I? You know what I mean? Like, I'm thinking, what are you going to give me? Like a $2,000 advance? I don't know. They don't know me from Adam, and so I figured let me write it. Let's write it, and if I ever write another one, then maybe I'll explore a traditional publishing. Or honestly, I've had such great results with self-publishing, I may do the same thing. But that's kind of the rationale as to why I chose to go this self-publishing route.
Right. I think one of the things that's been so awesome in just the industry in general is how self-publishing no longer has the stigma that it had 15, 20 years ago. Amazon has changed that industry so much. Technology has changed that industry so much that really it forces you to go ahead and ask those questions like, oh, okay, what does a publisher actually do for me? With ebooks and Amazon distribution, yes, it's still important to get into traditional bookstores, but it's not nearly as important as it used to be.
No, not to get started. Now, I will say that if I was going to write a book, I also, in a very blunt way, I didn't want it to suck. You know what I mean? And
Sure.
So it was like, look, if you're going to write a book, then go out and get it edited by the professionals. Get it designed by the professionals. I'm not taking what my kids bring home from elementary school and throwing it up on Amazon and trying to sell it just because I can.
Absolutely.
And so, yes, it's easier to get self-published, but I think it comes back down to, well, what kind of a book do you want to really have your name on? You and I can write a book, 10 pages, quickly throw it up on Amazon and call ourselves authors. And yeah, we have the right to do that. My thought process is, but I don't want to put my name on something that I'm not proud of.
Right.
And so, yes, you have that flexibility, but the integrity piece of it still comes down to, look, if you're going to do something, do it well, do it right.
Absolutely. And having that existing platform and already being understanding that need for going out and finding an editor, finding the designers, and being able to go ahead and acquire those resources and those people to work with yourself instead of having to rely on somebody else just gives you so much more options and so much more flexibility and so much more responsibility.
Correct. Yes. But worthwhile. It's all worthwhile.
Absolutely. And it's going to vary obviously person to person, what they already bring to the table, what they're going to need from somebody else, what they're simply not going to want to deal with themselves. And it's all about finding that right mix for your individual situation, almost like finding the right mix of therapists and treatment and recovery as you go ahead and live your new life.
It's so true. The therapists, the docs that you work with, I mean, they have a big influence on your progression, on your mental progression as well. And I came across some docs along this journey that I thought were just outstanding. Their knowledge was great. Their bedside manner was great. It was just, I was so fortunate. And there were one or two that, I'll say that I didn't care for, and you have them as well. But is that really any different than people outside of the medical industry anyway? I mean, we come across people that we gravitate toward more, we connect with in a better way than others, and no different. So it's just
Absolutely.
a different environment.
And there are some of those doctors that you deal with them and you think, you know what? You would make a great researcher.
Yes, absolutely.
So let me ask this impossible question then. What do you think your life and business would look like today if you hadn't had those moments sitting on the dining room floor?
I think I'd still be married because that, if anything, I'll tell you without the stroke, with the stroke, I think my relationship with Whitney has even grown stronger. But I think it was strong to begin with. And so I would certainly be married with kids. Professionally, I enjoyed the job that I had. Maybe I would probably be in a different job simply because my track record is such where I'm someone that bounces around every 3.5 to 4 years or so. At least that's up to that point. That's what I had done. So I'd be in a different profession possibly, but I would say that I would be more concerned about what my life would look like without the stroke, simply because I don't know if I would have thought about things in the same way that I do today. I think I'm much more intentional today about living in a very specific way, living in a very significant, purpose-filled way. And so to some degree, I'm a little bit fearful of what life would have looked like without that. I think I would have been fine. I think it would have been successful. I think I would have been happy like I was previously. I just don't know if I would have had the depth of thought and intentionality that I do today.
And that brings us to our hack of the week.
And a lot of it is mindset, is becoming very conscious of the framework we have created around this event. And I think I'm a big believer that it starts with that. If you feel that you are a stroke victim, you will stay a stroke victim. And with that victim mentality will come a whole slew of thoughts of why you cannot do something. You'll spend more time of why it never should have happened. There's going to be judgment around that event. And I think it's going to impede any kind of recovery. So let's get the right framework around it. We're still here. If you're listening to the podcast, you're still here. You still have a lot to offer. You have a ton of value. You still matter. And so maybe the bigger challenge is really trying to figure out, how do we reframe the context of that event and going out into the world and mattering more in a much bigger way.
If folks want to know more about you and what you're up to, where should they go?
They can go to the website. It's smithimpact.com.
So Pete, thanks so much for joining us here this week. This has been great.
Thanks, Bill. Again, I appreciate the invite. It's been fun.
Pete's stroke gave him that moment of clarity upon which he was able to rebuild his career. The stroke that I had and that other survivors have had are life-threatening and life-changing events, regardless of the deficits they may or may not leave us with. We learn to face new challenges. We learn about biology. We meet new people in the survivor community. We may be forced to pursue a new lifestyle. It may not be easy, but it's up to us to find the value in these experiences and figure out how we can move forward in this new world. So check out Pete's website and book by visiting the links over at strokecast.com/impact. Make it impact on folks around you by sharing this episode. Give folks the link, strokecast.com/impact. Choose the mindset that will help you extract value from this experience. And of course, as always, don't get best, get better. Thanks a lot. I'm Bill Monroe, and I'll talk to you next week.
The Strokecast, Bill Monroe, and Bill's guests provide general information and entertainment, not medical advice. Please do not make any changes to your treatment plan or the execution of your treatment plan without first consulting your personal doctor or medical team. The Strokecast is a proud production of the Currently Speaking Podcast Network.